Initially, it may seem odd to use a song like Theme of Laura to set the stage for your psychological horror video game. Personally speaking, I don't think I've ever heard a guitar rock song used as the opening track to any horror property. Horror themes usually sound something like this. But just because an electric guitar isn't the first instrument I think of when it comes to horror, that doesn't mean the song is ill-fitting for the mood of Silent Hill 2. Despite being such a melodic rock and roll foot tapper, Theme of Laura manages to maintain an undercurrent of intense melancholy between the minor key or the backing violin. All of this music is the backdrop to out-of-context, cutting-edge CG cutscenes featuring the characters of the game, interestingly enough, just talking to each other, with only the occasional peek at some of the grotesque monsters you'd expect from a horror game. The game is being upfront here. What's just as, if not more interesting than monsters in Silent Hill 2 are the other characters our protagonist, James Sunderland, meets while exploring the titular town. The town which has a way of putting a mirror up to people and seeing how they look on the other side. Theme of Laura is a personal favorite track of mine from this game, but it's far from the only standout piece composer Akira Yamaoka made for the game. Silent Hill 2 is a game that's taken up something of a life of its own over the years, eclipsing discussion of its successors on the PS2 and even its predecessor on the original PlayStation. That does make sense, considering its connections to Silent Hill 1 and 3 are fairly minimal outside of the setting being the same. This made Silent Hill 2 a good starting point at the time for those who found themselves with Sony's brand new cutting-edge console and $50 burning in their pocket. Being one of the greatest games to ever grace the hardware helps too, of course. When it comes to attracting newcomers, I find Silent Hill 2 is, ironically enough, very welcoming. Like many survival horror games of its time, SH2 takes a page out of the likes of Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil. What separates Silent Hill 2 from previous 5th-gen survival horror, however, are two things. One being the breadth of controls. Early survival horror, or hell, early 3D games in general, stuck to a method of movement colloquially known as tank controls. The reason for this was, I imagine, because it played the nicest with the practice of moving a 3D character over pre-rendered backgrounds. Unlike many older survival horror games, Silent Hill 2 gave players the option to switch between the tank controls of yore or a more modern 2D control method, where James will move in whatever direction the stick goes relative to the camera. Now, admittedly, this isn't a perfect control scheme, as it can cause James to awkwardly reorient himself whenever the camera angle changes unexpectedly. This is an issue I've encountered in many fixed camera games with more modern controls. Only one game has ever gotten it right. But overall, I find this makes the play experience much more smooth. It lets players who dislike tank controls sidestep the control scheme entirely, and personally, I don't think the easier movement detracted much from the experience of Silent Hill 2. Besides, the consistency of the tank controls ends up conflicting somewhat with the camera of Silent Hill 2 anyway, and it's because of one major difference between the series and its forefathers. Unlike old-school Resident Evil, the town of Silent Hill is not pre-rendered. Everything is rendered in real time. This means that SH2 is able to adjust the camera on the fly. It's not uncommon for a fixed shot to slowly pan from side to side, zoom in and out, or get even more ambitious. These tricks really flaunt the capabilities of the PlayStation 2, since this is only possible thanks to the environments not being pre-rendered. Of course, it helps that much of the larger, fully rendered environments are smothered in obscurity by the now iconic fog of the town, allowing the system to load in sections of the map at a pace the console was prepared for. Silent Hill 2 also runs at 30 FPS, half of the framerate standard the industry was beginning to return to with the advent of the 6th generation. Yes, as nice as Silent Hill 2 looks, it does come at a price being a then PlayStation 2 exclusive. General consensus at the time, as well as analysis in hindsight, showed that the PlayStation 2 was the second weakest of the 6th generation of consoles, only trailing ahead of the Sega Dreamcast. With that said, the PS2's version of Silent Hill 2 is preferred to the Xbox port seen a few years later, ironically enough. Regardless, this game is a looker, and not just when people are posting emulated up-res screenshots online. Its dingy, dark environments play really well with the screens they were meant to be seen on. You would think that there wouldn't be much variety to be found throughout Silent Hill. After all, it's a contemporary New England town. I live in one of those, and let me personally tell you, there's not much to do in one. Despite that, the game does manage to throw James through a nice handful of locales. He explores places like an apartment complex, a hotel, a park, and even a hospital for answers over the whereabouts of his presumed dead wife. Now, admittedly, said locations aren't bastions of impeccable level design. If anything, the design ethos for most of Silent Hill 2's areas seem to be an adherence to realism above all else, barring a few exceptions. Take the apartment complex, for instance. It's the first major area the player will venture through, and almost every single door throughout its long hallways are either locked and unopenable. Any Silent Hill 2 fan watching this should have that text burned into the back of their skulls after the amount of time they end up reading it by the end of the game. This may come across as some sort of harsh critique of the level design, and while I could understand someone really not gelling with Silent Hill 2's banal approach to crafting explorable areas, it isn't necessarily something I found all that bothersome in the moment. Occasionally there would be times where I'd gotten turned around or frustratingly reached for a red herring door, but there's something to be said about how many of the areas in Silent Hill 2 have these mundane layouts, especially when something strange happens to them. The apartment complex, inexplicably, has a sister building a mere 6 inches away from the other, making it traversable via the fire escape. It's one of the earliest areas in the game, and sure, by that point the cat is out of the bag regarding the supernatural forces of the town, but there's a slight plausible deniability to this instance, like an unaccounted for third of an inch to a house. Of course, things eventually escalate to much more ridiculous examples, including a near literal 5.5-minute hallway, but there's a ramp up to these more unusual, or rather scary changes to the mundane Silent Hill, which is to say nothing of the otherworld sections. There's never really a moment where you feel relaxed in Silent Hill, but it's easy to realize that you took the eerily quiet, fog-smothered streets of the town for granted once it gets dark out. As if it wasn't enough that it's pitch dark and the all-encompassing fog is still permeating, the streets are now literally crawling with monsters. The sound design does no favors either. If Yamaoka didn't prove to you he could unnerve already, this'll be the moment where he pulls it off. But if you can believe it, the dark streets of the town isn't the scariest area in the game. That award would have to go to the Silent Hill Historical Society. At this point in the game, the gloves are off and the town isn't holding back anymore. This area is where the sound design is at its peak. Derek Alexander from Stop Skeletons from Fighting actually has a really good video you should check out where he does a deep dive on this area. Comes highly recommended. I think for a lot of people, whether they know it consciously or not, difficulty and horror in games are correlated. Reason being because the stress of a difficult game can put a player on edge. Horror games are also setting out to put the player on edge, aka scare them, so it makes sense that when designing a horror game, you'd want it to be difficult. It's where the survival in survival horror comes in. With all of that said, Silent Hill 2 is not a difficult game. In fact, I found it to be quite easy. It's not even just because of the alternate control scheme. The game spoils the player with an abundance of weapon ammunition, a survival horror faux pas. As if that wasn't enough, enemies are usually simple enough to take down. Most are slow, shambling monstrosities that collapse after taking a quarter's worth of a magazine to the chest. The auto-aim does most of the work. Best of all, when said enemies collapse, instead of waiting around for their surprising return, James can literally snuff their life out by hitting the X button while standing over them. It's a little finicky, but easy enough to pull off, and its reward is well worth the effort. It's something anyone playing this game will want to incorporate into their strategy immediately, lest you have to deal with the likes of the blisteringly fast lying figures. The toughest enemies in the game, hilarious enough, might just be the cockroaches, since they're so difficult to actually kill using the stomp method. You might think that I'm admonishing the game for its lack of challenge, but that's far from the case. I actually like that it's not all that tough. and even though I didn't think it was very difficult, its hopeless brand of horror kept me on edge plenty throughout my playthrough. Not to mention, there were still times where I did fear for my safety, such as whenever Pyramid Head made an appearance. If the low difficulty of the game is something that bothers you, then you might want to try your luck with the game's hard mode. In a novel decision, Silent Hill 2 as a series actually allows the player to select the difficulty for both action and puzzles. So if, for instance, you're not interested in the enemies being more challenging, but are looking for some real brain teasers, the game lets you modulate the difficulty to your liking. It's an ahead-of-its-time decision that draws easy comparisons to modern-day accessibility settings, albeit not as robust. With that said, apparently Silent Hill 2's harder action difficulty is your run-of-the-mill boring difficulty increase, simply making things hit harder and take longer to kill. It's not as well fleshed out as the puzzle difficulties, which obscures the puzzles in more and more ciphers the higher the challenge. Personally, I stuck with the default difficulties and found the experience on both ends to be just fine, barring the odd moon logic puzzle or two. You're better off sticking with the normal difficulty for action, in my opinion. Especially if you plan on doing repeat playthroughs, something the Silent Hill series makes very enticing. Silent Hill 2 is loaded with secrets that can only be found on a repeat playthrough, be it special weapons or brand new endings. Many of these secrets are actually pretty goofy too. Maybe it's strange for some, but the fact that they're locked behind a second pass to the town ensures first-time players will never accidentally encounter a secret that completely undermines the very serious story of the game. A story that gets further enriched by repeat playthroughs. The cast of Silent Hill 2 is small, but each character makes a meaningful impression. They're all multifaceted, fascinating, and full of contradictions that make discussion of them practically flow out like a busted faucet. Not counting James, the player character, the first person the player gets to know is Angela. Angela is a young girl who has ventured into Silent Hill in search of her mother. In that regard, her and James are pretty similar, but that's basically where the similarities end. Angela is one of the more tragic characters, as her suicidal tendencies and mood swings get contextualized throughout the game as coping mechanisms for the sexual assault committed by her father, whom she ended up killing. The town preys on her guilt over this decision, and it ultimately leads to her death, as she gets consumed by a literal hell of her own design. It's a very well done portrayal of a sexual abuse survivor. Eddie is another excellent character. Discussion online doesn't focus as much on him, but that makes sense. He's not as outwardly sympathetic as Angela is, what with his slobbish appearance and homicidal tendencies that crop up the more he unravels. Despite these ugly aspects to his character, I do still feel bad for him. His crimes are bad, but not outright murder of a human being, despite what he might posture about. He's apparently on the lam for shooting a kid in the leg, so any murder he talks about must be of the monsters seen in Silent Hill. We know that these creatures are definitely not human. Realistically though, he thinks he's killing people, which might as well be the same as actually doing it with regards to showing off a person's true character. But while I certainly wouldn't condone his actions, as a guy who has struggled with his weight his whole life, I can empathize with his self-esteem issues. And I can certainly understand how he could just sit there and eat pizza. Out of all of Silent Hill 2's cast, Laura is probably the least complex, but that makes sense, since she's just a child. She is a bit of a brat, especially to James, but she has her reasons for doing the things she does. What's most interesting about Laura is what her decisions inform to us about the mechanics of the town itself. Since she's a child, she doesn't have anything in her subconscious for the town to prey on. She's also the only character besides James who seemed to know Mary. Her story contradicts James's recollection of the events leading up to Mary's death, but we'll get more into that in a moment. Before we can talk about James, we need to talk about Maria. It's hard to really get a grasp on what exactly the deal is with Maria outside of the broad strokes. She's another manifestation of the town, born from a wish, if you will, as the perceived ideal version of Mary for James to covet. It's easy to write her off as a temptress, and to an extent that's what she is, but the extra scenario blurs that line somewhat. She doesn't want to be alone and has an immense fear of pain. By being near James, she's ruthlessly murdered by his demon several times, and depending on the ending you get, is rejected by James anyway. It's a terrible fate that was thrust upon her. It's these fears that recontextualize her actions in the main story. Whether or not that's what she actually believes, or if that's just something the town instilled in her mind, is up for debate. I really can't say for sure. The central protagonist of Silent Hill 2, James Sunderland, is fittingly the most complicated and fleshed out character in the game. We as the player spend the most time with him, as well as see everything through his eyes. Silent Hill manifests people's guilt and trauma into real-life monsters, so thanks to that, it's possible to infer a lot about James without him having to monologue constantly. James starts out as an unassuming, grieving widower, but the more the plot unravels, the more the player learns things about him that flip that perception on its head and reveal his uglier side. The side that resented his bedridden wife for the constant care she required, the carnal side that wanted something she couldn't provide, and the side that wanted to punish himself for thinking these things. This unraveling culminates in the climax of the story, where James realizes that not only did his wife die shortly before this trip to Silent Hill, as opposed to 3 years ago, her death was at the hands of her husband, not the disease. James killed his own wife, and it's a testament to how well done Silent Hill 2's story is that a character who did such a thing feels so hard to dislike. It lays out the ugliest aspects of James in front of the player and leaves it up to them to decide how they want to see him. Do they think James deserves retribution? There's the in water ending. A second chance? Then there's the leave ending. The Maria ending in particular draws a certain conclusion for him, a pretty ugly one at that. Silent Hill 2's method of providing the context and characteristics for James and allowing the player to draw their own conclusions via these different endings feels unique to the medium of games. There isn't necessarily a correct answer, but I personally have a favorite ending, and I'm sure everyone else watching this does as well. And thanks to this approach, each of our readings are just as valid. Before moving on from discussing the characters, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the voice acting. 2001 is around the time that high-profile video games started to feature fully voiced cutscenes, but it would still be a few years before these performances would be considered good by and large. Of course, there were examples of such a thing, but for most games, voice acting felt like a novelty that would more often than not detract from the story thanks to wooden performances. Silent Hill 2 is not one of those games. Silent Hill 2 is genuinely full of performances that feel once in a lifetime. Many point out how stilted and strange some of the voices are, but they're not strange in the way many contemporary VO was. Silent Hill 2's cast sounds awkward in the same way that a conversation between two uncomfortable strangers sounds awkward. All of the performances feel very real. And I think a lot of that comes from the cast being composed of, at the time, relative unknowns that were meant to be the definitive voices for these characters, as opposed to dubbing over Japanese performances. There's a reason people were upset with the HD remaster's redub. Every performance in this game is excellent, but the best performance in the game, bar none, is Monica Taylor Horgan's portrayal of both Maria and Mary. Every single scene she's in, she absolutely kills. Her final monologue in particular is incredibly haunting. A beautiful capstone to the lightning in a bottle that is Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2 is a game that's earned its flowers and then some. It's hard to truly examine it in this day and age and come away with some new insight. That said, discussing a game and playing it are two very different things. For those who have played Silent Hill 2, I want you to share with me some theories you had while playing the game. It's a game full of meaning if you're willing to dig through it, and despite all of the digging over the years, I'm sure everyone who's played it can come up with at least one thing no one has contributed to the zeitgeist. Case in point. When I played through the game for the first time, I wondered what the red save point squares were meant to be. I came up with a theory that they're meant to represent a literal red letter day, which is a saying meant to signify a day of great importance. It's also used a lot these days within the context of happier events, like a wedding, but its usage in Silent Hill wouldn't completely contradict that original meaning, especially when we remember that the town seems to taunt James at every opportunity. Is this theory complete bunk? Maybe. But it's something that I naturally thought of while playing through the game, which proves how engaged I was for its runtime. If you've never played Silent Hill 2, it comes highly recommended from the Reps to GOG project. You probably didn't need its endorsement, but it's unlikely there will be many games that eclipse it in quality from the PS2 library. Finding a copy these days can be pretty pricey, so I'd recommend looking into the Silent Hill 2 Enhanced Edition PC mod. Or just emulating the original, or, using some sort of hard drive solution for the PlayStation 2. Just don't go looking for the HD remaster.
What was that?